There are three things about this whole thing, Tom, that no one can deny. They're incontrovertible points. Even the grossest skeptic can't deny them. First of all is that the UFO reports not only exist but persist. See, when I started with the Air Force, I thought that this was a fad. In a few years would just disappear.
Be all over, okay.
And it's global. We have reports now from 140 countries. I mean, practically as many countries as there are in the United Nations. And the most important of the three things is that many, unfortunately not all, but many of the reports come from highly, highly credible, technically trained people, you see. Well, the pressure was mounting for an official explanation. There were more than 60 newsmen jammed in at that news conference. I gave what I thought to be at that time the only scientific explanation possible for the faint lights in the swampy area. I made the statement that it could be swamp gas, and even though I went on to emphasize that I couldn't prove it in a court of law, that was the full explanation for these sightings. Well, the press picked up the phrase swamp gas and rushed off to the telephones, and I was to come into a great deal of criticism over it. I was there at Blue Book, and I know the job they had. They were told not to excite the public. Don't rock the boat. And I saw it in my own eyes happen that whenever a case happened that they could explain, which is quite a few, they made point of that and let that out to the media. Things that the cases that were very difficult to explain, they would jump handsprings to keep the media away. Rise of interest among scientists, and particularly astronomers, in the UFO problem. So it has often been said that, why don't astronomers see UFOs? As a matter of fact, they do. In a very recent report by Professor Sturrock of Stanford University, who queried all the members of the American Astronomical Society, found that 53% of those who responded said that, in their opinion, the UFO problem was worthy of scientific study. And what is more, 64 of the astronomers who responded gave what would be called UFO reports, objects, sightings that they personally had made at their observatories frequently, which to them was unexplained. I first became associated with the UFO problem. In 1948, the Air Force asked me, as an astronomer, to assist them in seeing how many of the reports on flying saucers that were coming in at that time could be explained astronomically. And one thing led to another, and I became scientific consultant to the Air Force and remained so for some 20 years. I started almost as a complete skeptic because I thought the whole thing was a question of post-war nerves, but it was the persistence of the phenomenon, it refused to dry up and blow away, that finally led me to the belief that we had a real phenomenon to deal with. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the advent of the flying saucer, and that is a most unfortunate term, in my opinion, because it invites ridicule. It opens the door to a great deal of buffoonery and lampooning. It had a perfectly good history, because when Kenneth Arnold described the motions of the discs that he had seen, he said that it was like skipping a saucer over water. But some reporter thought that was a very clever term, and flying saucers were born. But it is really too bad, because it has caused a great deal of jokes and so forth. For instance, one common expression is that if you want to see a flying saucer, just goose the waitress. There is a shyness and a reluctance on the part of many witnesses, and understandably so, against reporting, because too many have been ridiculed and life has been made somewhat miserable for them. But at the Center for UFO Studies, both in the States and in Australia, it is our standard practice never to use a person's name without their specific permission. If, for instance, NASA someday were to investigate a civilization in some other solar system and found that civilization to be several steps below our state at that time, then we would know enough about psychology and sociology to realize that the worst thing we could do would be to just barge in and snow them
It would just either cause panic or worship. What a smart group would do would be to slowly infiltrate, slowly begin to affect the mass mind and get them conditioned to the idea that they might be visited someday. Slowly, the mass mind begins to accept the idea that, well, it's not so unusual. Yeah, sure. You know, the way in science things have very frequently gone. The first step is complete disbelief. Then there comes a stage where they say, well, you know, it might be so. Then the third and final stage is, oh, I knew it all the time. And Bernard Shaw said all great ideas, you know, begin as heresies.
Unidentified flying objects have been popular since 1947, 1948, when the first bevy of them were sighted. Before that, were there any reports in history, as far as you're concerned, of UFOs?
Oh, yes, there were many reports, but still they're so hard to track down. Even now, if a report is more than, say, a year or two old, it's hard to track down. But, of course, clear back to biblical times, Ezekiel's wheel would have been a good example, and Saul of Tarsus and the road to Damascus, and, all through history there have been reports and stories of strange sights in the sky and on the ground. But I have my hands so full with the present ones, I mean the current ones, that it's hardly any point to worry about the others.
How do you go about investigating a UFO report? You get a report of a sighting. If it sounds reasonable to you, do you then contact the people and do an in-depth interview with them?
Oh, not only the people, but a lot of peripheral material. We have an outgoing Watts line, and we have a full-time paid investigator, and as calls come in, and we get through our police hotline, we get several calls a day, certainly. He then contacts not only the original witnesses, but the police departments in that area, the FAA, the Weather Bureau, NORAD, radar installations. In other words, he does everything he can to break it down into a normal thing.
You say who are you talking about now?
I'm talking about our paid investigator, Mr. Alan Hendry, who is the chap who does a very fine job in tracking down. And then, of course, we have a corps of investigators around the country who we can enlist on a volunteer basis.
Are there some that are just so ridiculous and seem so unlikely to be anything worthwhile that you just simply, after the initial evidence, you don't bother investigating them any further?
Well, it's the ones that are unlikely, the strange ones, are the ones we really find we have to investigate. The ones that we don't have to investigate are so typical. For instance, we will get stories that are generated by these advertising planes. You know, the planes that have these rotating marquee lights. From a distance, those look like a rotating disc. But we can spot them, and Mr. Hendry has the phone numbers of some 70 airplane advertising companies, and all we do is call those places and ask them, did you have a plane at that point at that time? What we do in this, the publication you have under your elbow there, the International UFO Reporter, each month we publish, if you take a look at the back page, each month we publish a map of the United States in which we plot all the cases that have come to our attention. Those that we can solve, we plot as dots. Those that we can't solve, we plot as stars. Of course, it's the stars we're interested in, but you can see also that the dots far outnumber the stars. The people simply are not aware of the number of purely normal things that a person can see in the sky.
Now, what's an IFO? The dots are IFOs.
Those are identified flying objects.
Okay, and you've got, looking at the map, it looks as though there were 3 or 4 identified flying objects spotted in the Detroit area.
Oh, I'm sure. Each month. Now, this, I think maybe, and I want to mention this several times, maybe a good starter right now. You started out with the introductory music from Close Encounters, which title, by the way, was my title. I call this the $18 million movie with a $1,000 title because that's all I got for the title.
You described this to me on the phone a month ago or so. Well, actually 3 weeks ago. But let's do it again. Let's go back to the beginning. What does a close encounter mean?
Okay. A close encounter is a sighting that is close, and by close I mean within a few hundred feet, less than 500 feet generally. In other words, there should be little chance of misidentifying it with a Venus or a twinkling star. I mean, it's close by.
Okay.
And I divided them purposely into 3 kinds. Close encounters of the first kind, the second kind, and the third kind. The first kind is close, but nothing really happens outside the fact that people get frightened, and it's quite an experience for them. The close encounters of the second kind are those in which some sort of physical residue, not a part of a UFO. We still don't have a front bumper from a UFO or anything like that. But we do have hundreds of cases, and I mean hundreds, of cases in which at the precise spot where the UFO is seen, there is a burnt ring or holes in the ground that obviously don't seem to be coming from anything else, broken tree branches, animals affected.
Animals affected how, sir?
Well, they'll get tremendously panicky. Cattle will stampede, for instance, or horses will raise a fuss in the barn, and we've had cases of, course, dogs wildly barking, and that's not terribly exciting. But we've had cases of a bull, for instance, that was tethered to an iron rod through its nose, and it got so frightened it bent the iron rod in half. So that, I'd say, is an animal effect, or an effect on the animal. And we had, at the Center for UFO Studies, we have now published a catalog of some 1,100 now, of such cases.
Okay. This UFO Reporter, this monthly that you release for $1, we'll get to in just a few minutes. I want to talk to you, though, about the much celebrated release of information by the Air Force. For years, the Air Force kept a lid on all this UFO information. In People magazine in August 1976, in a big article about you said the Air Force will open its UFO files and it will make juicy reading. Well, that's a year and a half ago. Nothing startling has come up. President Carter indicated, or at least U.S. News and World Report magazine indicated that President Carter this year would make some sort of announcement about UFOs. Nothing. There's always been an awful lot of smoke, but no fire. What is it? What is
well,
it all
the
about?
only solid thing that's come out of that. See, President Carter asked NASA to undertake a study of the UFOs, and they very politely refused. And they had good reasons, but I would like to talk about those later. The Air Force did, or the National Archives did release the files of Project Blue Book, on which I was consultant for a good many years. And that is incorporated in my new book, which is very modestly called the Hynek UFO Report. What I do there is, I think that many of those do make juicy reading. Juicy not in the usual newsstand sense, but juicy in the sense that it shows how the Air Force really bungled many of the cases and did a very real job of keeping cases from the public.
Why? Why would they do that?
Largely because they were operating under a very strong recommendation from the CIA, which convened a special panel in 1953 called the Robertson Panel, in which I was an associate member, incidentally. The CIA was not frightened of UFOs. They were frightened of UFO reports. They were afraid that the public might panic, and at that time particularly, they were terribly concerned about subversive elements in the country. And they thought that these subversive elements, the communists, might use the whole UFO phenomenon, the UFO clubs and the UFO organizations, as fronts for subversive activities. And so they strongly recommended that the Air Force do everything it could to debunk the situation. And
you were one of the major debunkers.
I was one of the major debunkers. I mean, because I thought that the whole thing was a lot of junk.
Have you changed your mind?
Yes,
significantly?
Absolutely significantly. Otherwise, I wouldn't be heading up the Center for UFO Studies.
Do you believe that many of these UFO reports are not only real, but that are extraterrestrially directed?
There are three basic theories of the UFO today. One, the first, of course, is that it is complete nonsense. Second is that they are extraterrestrial vehicles. And the third is that they really represent something from another dimension, a parallel reality. There may be 4 or 5 others that I don't know about. Oh, there are some fanciful ones, very fanciful indeed. All of these are fanciful, except the first one. I think that's fanciful too. There are some people who speak of our future coming back to look at us, and things that would certainly be sheer science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But
that sounds like science fiction. Can you even buy the concept of that? Our future coming back to look at us?
I can't.
Time machine stuff?
No,
okay.
I can't.
Where are they for? What's the parallel reality?
Well, that's an intriguing concept. And it shouldn't bother us so much because, good heavens, I don't know which particular religion you happen to be, but of all of our major religions and the great philosophers and prophets of the past have all told us that the physical world is not the whole thing, that there are other planes of existence. Where do angels exist, for instance? The Bible's full of angels, for instance. Well, that would be an example of a parallel reality. Or another more practical example is right now, even though we're in a radio studio, there are passing through this room television pictures that we can't see, but it represents a sort of a parallel reality.
Okay.
Another dimension, put it that way. There's nothing too fanciful about that. I mean,
well, there's nothing fanciful about it from the sense that it's been discussed for a long time, but when you stop and think about it, it doesn't make any sense at all. A two-dimensional thing, something that has no depth, that doesn't make sense to me. And why would it appear suddenly?
No,
our
not a two-dimensional, but a four- or five-dimensional.
Why would it suddenly appear in ours? In our three-dimensional world?
An interface. Have you ever read seen this delightful little book called Flatland by A. Square?
Yes.
And there, you see, it brings it down by one dimension. It talks about creatures, triangles, octagons, hexagons, and squares that all live on a large sheet of paper.
Yeah.
And I think it's the triangles have precedence over the squares, and when a triangle meets a square, the square's got to give way. And one day a sphere comes to visit them. And you remember what happens. To these people that live in the two dimensions, they first see it as a point, and it enlarges to a large circle, and then it disappears again as the sphere passes through that sheet of paper, you see. And all you have to do, and I say all you have to do, is just up that by one dimension. Instead of a two-dimensional, we're three-dimensional. And a four-dimensional thing would appear to us magically. It would appear by magic, much like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. Remember the Cheshire Cat that disappeared, leaving only its grin? Where it went into another dimension.